I want to talk to you about your investing approach. You say you're an anthropological investor. What exactly does that mean?
Sure. I think, all investors approach these kind of early stage investments in different ways. When I say an anthropological investor, what I mean by that is really wanting to start with how consumers are using the end products and then backing into what are the products or services that need to exist to support those types of human behaviors.
So everybody wants to talk about the future of work, but nobody knows exactly what the future of work and jobs is going to look like. What is your sort of vision for that, and then how does that impact the choices that you're making when it comes to where to put your money?
Sure, yeah. So the topic of future of work, as you know, is nothing new, right? How people work, when they work, from what locations do they work is all kind of up in the air right now, which is really exciting and can transform how we all are spending our time in many ways. So when I think about the future of work, how I actually think about it is really less how people are compensated and more the future of how people spend their time. So I look at investing in this category very broadly in three buckets. The first being the technologies themselves that are making people more effective or efficient. This is, I think, where most of the conversation around the future of work has been, so things that are AI for X or autonomy for Y. The second bucket would be kind of how do you invest in the downstream effects of those first group of products. And then the third would be the platforms or marketplaces that are enabling people to find work. So Uber being a perfect example of that.
So how are people going to spend their time differently in the future?
So, if you think about the first bucket, right, is that many jobs are going to be made more efficient. Sometimes there's the conversation that they will be replaced altogether or really just fundamentally changed. I was earlier this morning looking up some statistics on the number of farmers in the U.S. A couple hundred years ago, 90% of people in the U.S. were farmers, and today it's about 1%. It doesn't mean that there are fewer jobs in total. In fact, there are far more, but the nature of those jobs has changed quite dramatically. So, I think that it's much more likely that we'll see forms of artificial intelligence that are working alongside people to help them do their jobs more effectively for many decades before we will ever see jobs replaced entirely.
So it's interesting because you were head of strategic ops for Uber Freight, which is their trucking business. You've also invested in autonomous trucking. So is trucking a job that you think, being a truck driver, is that going to exist?
Yes.
In 10 years, 20 years?
Yes.
So how will technology offset the number of people who actually are required to drive the trucks?
Sure. So I think trucking happens to be a passion topic of mine. So things you never thought you might say. But so the number of truck drivers represent about 1% of the population in the U.S. today. It's a very common, very popular job. The average truck driver is in his mid-50s and drives a long haul truck. As you think about the pieces of driving a truck, it looks very different if you're driving a truck or car, for that matter, through the streets of San Francisco or any other major metro than it does driving through perhaps an entire state in the middle of the country when you're going from major metro to major metro. Human beings and the nature of how complex that driving is very different. Just like if you were to do a cross-country road trip, you probably are on cruise control through, when I've done it, the eastern half of Nevada, for example, versus I'm never on cruise control driving down the street in San Francisco.
Right. So, curious, I mean, first of all, you worked at Uber for a year, working on Uber Freight, but what's your take on Uber ending, it's like almost 20% down for the last 2 days, 2 days into being a public company?
Yeah. Well, obviously, it's not the start that anybody would hope for. And I think, as with anything, it's very hard to make any call, when you're just 2 days into trading, for example. Ultimately, I think the future of Uber hinges on how quickly and how much they will be able to innovate from the core business that they have today. If you look at a company like Amazon, when they first started out, they were selling books, right? They don't just sell books today. They sell all sorts of things. They also have Amazon Web Services. They have tools and services for SMBs, and not to mention Prime. That's a subscription consumer service. None of those businesses existed when they started. And so what will Uber look like 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the road? I think is anybody's best guess.
What about what will the rest of the markets look like in 6 months? I mean, obviously we're dealing with the trade war. A lot of companies got hit today, but Uber by far among the worst, and certainly down more than the broader market. So there must be some skepticism about the business model in general. I mean, as an investor who's backing companies that are, potentially entering the public markets at some point, how concerned are you about this environment?
I think my job at Redpoint is primarily a very early stage investor, right? We're investing in the Series A's of companies. And so the future of how large those businesses can become is so far in the future that what the markets look like 6 months from now have very little to no influence on the kind of companies that we're investing in today.